morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to have you guys here on this holiday-ish weekend. And we're going to be in Luke chapter 10, if you'd like to turn there. We're going to start a new sermon series called Shape to Serve. And really what we're going to be talking about is the fact that God has created us for a purpose. And that purpose is service. And without being able to engage in that, you can never find who God meant you to be and never find the life that He intended for you to live. And so, if you'll turn to Luke chapter 10, verse 38, today we're talking about the fact that serving is second. And I know it sounds weird to talk about, we have a sermon series on service, and the first thing I'm telling you is that service is not the most important thing. But that's indeed what we're doing. So that's where we're at. Luke chapter 10, verse 38 will help us to get there. And as we talk about this, we're going to talk about, first of all, the idea of good intentions, because we all have them, don't we? And then secondly, we're going to talk about the vine and the branches. And finally, we're going to talk about being served by Christ, because that's ultimately where we're going here. And so, before we get into this sermon series, I wanted to tell you a story that I was listening to online. It was about a guy named Dallas Stoudemire. Do you guys, anybody here ever heard of Dallas Stoudemire? If any of you are interested in the Old West, the Old West was full of, gunfighters and cowboys and, all kinds of, you think of conflict and really just kind of think life on the edge. Life is as intensely as you can possibly experience it. And Dallas was a great example of that. In fact, he was possibly in more gunfights than any other kind of Old West guy. And in fact, even though you've heard of Wyatt Earp and all those kinds of guys, Dallas Stoudemire was actually in more gunfights than that. He was a lawman, and he didn't start off being a lawman. He did a bunch of other stuff, but he was always practicing with his gun, and he was a pretty, let's say, straightforward type guy. In fact, some people might call him violent. But what was happening is that in the town of El Paso at the time, it was a completely lawless town. Nobody was in control of anything. They had a guy there that was hired to keep the peace in the town, and he was apparently drunk all the time and completely useless. And so the town just was going to pieces. People were murdered all the time. And so they hired Dallas to be the lawman there. And what happened was that he came in, and he, within just a couple of days of arriving, he was in one of the most famous gunfights in the Old West. It's called the 4 Dead in 5 Seconds gunfight. And because that's kind of how it played out. And the reason that it went this way is because upon arriving in town, Dallas was told that he needed to go to the current guy who was doing the job, who was not going to be doing the job anymore, and get the keys to the jail. But when he showed up to get the keys from this guy, he was drunk, and he was giving Dallas a hard time, and basically, well, I don't know what keys belong to the city and me, and I'll figure it out sometime, and come back later. Just basically blowing him off. And so Dallas decided to pick him up in front of everybody and throw him on the ground and take the keys from him. The guy that was thrown to the ground did not appreciate this treatment and basically started plotting to kill him, which ended up in this 5 Dead in 4 Seconds gunfight, which then angered more people that wanted to kill him, which then he, in the next 7 days or so, he ended up in like 6 more gunfights. And eventually, he brought the town under control. But the fact that he rubbed everybody the wrong way and had a problem with being an angry drunk ended up meaning that he isolated himself, and more of the town turned against him. And eventually, he was killed in a gunfight in the town of El Paso after he had been fired from the job, but then got a job as a marshal instead of the town sheriff. Well, why do we talk about this story? The issue here is that even though he was doing a good thing, Dallas was there to clean up the town. It was a town that was full of violent men that were taking advantage of peaceful people. And he was kind of the guy for that job. He wasn't afraid of anything. He was doing a job that he was paid to do, and it was a good worthwhile job to keep the peace and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The problem is that he worked in the wrong spirit. He didn't do it because it was a good thing to do. He did it because he was getting paid to do it, and that's the kind of guy he was. He was a violent man. He was just an angry, violent guy who was good with a gun. And because he couldn't make friends, he found himself more and more isolated because all the people he picked on had friends. Or all the people he necessarily picked on, but all the people that he ended up getting in gunfights with while trying to keep the law and order in the town all had friends, and he never had any. The problem was that he found himself outnumbered. My point is this, is that it's not enough just to find yourself in the position of doing a good service. The way that we do our service is incredibly important. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go to chapter 10 of Luke, verse 38. It says, "Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching." Now, this is a group of people. There's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. This is a family that is friends with Jesus. And that's kind of an interesting thing to think of, isn't it? The idea that Jesus had friends. We don't think of that a lot. We think about him going off and, he's healing people, and you kind of see in a lot of the movies, you see the Prozac Jesus who's just kind of all very calm and proper, and he's dispensing miracles and doing those kinds of things and preaching about the kingdom. But you don't think of him as being a human being in the sense that he had friends and that he had relationships and that there were people who were close to him and who he cared about. So in looking at this text, we have to understand that this is a family that he's close to. And it says in verse 39, she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion which will not be taken away from her." Now, it's important to understand that this is a family that he was close to, because when you see that he rebukes her, you can hopefully see in this repetition of her name, Martha, Martha, a desire to bless her, a desire. He loves her. And while he needs to rebuke her for the fact that she is making a mistake, he does so, I think, with gentleness here. Now, what do we learn from this passage? And I think there's so many things we can learn. As we go through this series, some of these sermons in the series will be directed, if you haven't found your place to serve, they're going to be directed at helping you. If you haven't decided that you need to serve, they're going to be directed at motivating you. But this is more of a sermon, it's for everybody, but specifically the first group of people who will be able to apply this are people who are already serving. Because the challenge is that when you're serving, there are some pitfalls that you may not be aware of. There are some temptations that you can fall into when you're serving. And believe me, they're not far-fetched. If you're serving, or if you have served, if you're serving right now, if you're in the worship band, or if you run a ministry, if you're one of the people in church leadership, this is a present temptation for you to fall into these pitfalls. And so this is a sermon that's geared toward those who are serving, to make sure that our service is fruitful, and that our service leads to blessing, both for us and for the people around us. So let's talk about good intentions. Because I think that's the first thing we need to understand here, is that Martha has good intentions. She desires to be useful and help. But the problem is it doesn't turn out exactly the way she wants it to. And the first thing we need to understand is that service really isn't optional. Martha is drawn to serve for a reason, and that is because service it centers us. It puts us in a place that has a past, present, and future, and it also gives us an identity. It really is a redemption of our creation. Because what service does is it says this, is that you were made for something. You have your skills and the way that you were created and all the things, the quirky things about you, that there is some reason that God made you that way. And that reason is very valuable and important. And it has all of history as its canvas. Because from the very creation in Genesis, God gave Adam and Eve a work to do. He gave them service to do. He said, look, I put you in this garden. You're not just here to kick around and try to find meaning in your life, but that meaning is pre-installed. I've given you a task. I've given you a job. I've given you a goal. God has a goal in mind in creation, and we play a part in making that happen. And that is such a blessing to us because it makes sense out of everything, including our time. Every moment you have is there for a reason. Every ability you have has a meaning and a direction for it to express itself. And so it's not accidental that Martha is serving. We're drawn to service. We want to serve, but the problem is that we find that there are some things about us in our fallen nature that mess this up. And the first thing is that our good intentions aren't always as good as we think they are. In Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" And what that means is this, is that when we serve out of good intentions, even our good intentions really aren't all that good. Because what happens here is that Martha isn't content just to serve, is that she thinks somebody else should be serving along with her. She isn't saying, hey, you know what? Service is a blessing. If Mary's not going to serve, that leaves twice as much service for me. Whoopee! You see what I'm saying? And here's the thing, that if you find yourself, how many of you guys have ever found yourself at home muttering under your breath? Okay, this is one of the great childhood memories I have is at home. There's muttering going on under your breath. I work my hands to the bone around here. Nobody's helping me. Anybody ever found themselves with that kind of attitude? Okay? You're doing all the work, right? How many of you guys have ever lived with roommates? Right? There's a little bit of fraught with peril there, isn't it? Because the thing is that you don't see eye to eye. And how many times when you are in those situations do you think, woohoo, twice as much service for me? Why don't we think that? Why don't we think, man, isn't this great? Because here's the thing, like, if there was a key lime pie in the fridge and you got to eat the whole thing, you wouldn't be like, man, why isn't somebody helping me with this, right? Would you be like that? No. You'd be like, this is fantastic. I get the whole thing. But when it comes to service, even though we think, wow, I'm doing this because I'm generous at heart and everything, the reality is revealed that our heart isn't nearly as pure as we would like it to be, because we say, well, why? Somebody should be helping. Why am I the only person doing this, right? Our heart is deceitful. It wants to give us credit for things that aren't really there. And so the thing is that even though we have quote-unquote good intentions, those good intentions have a lot of negativity wrapped up in them. And we talked before, a couple of weeks ago, about how just a little bit of wrongness can make a lot of rightness become something other than a blessing. Now the second problem we have with our good intentions is that our wisdom is not adequate. So one of the things that I love about this is that when Martha finds that things aren't going the way she wants, she says to Jesus, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Basically, she's telling the creator of the universe what he needs to be doing right now. Right? That's not a good place to find yourself in, and yet we do that all the time. In fact, I would say that I do this so often, it's really embarrassing. Why in the world, God, did you let this thing happen, right? Why in the world? We were doing some work yesterday that involved painting. And there was a plastic drop cloth over the table. and as I put my cup of paint down, the plastic drop cloth had enough thickness to it that it was standing up, so the table actually ended before it looked like it ended. And as I went to put my cup down, I was putting it on nothing. There was nothing there. And so it spilled onto the thing I was working on. Have you guys ever had something like that happen? And what do you say? Why did that happen? Why? Come on, God, I'm trying to help you out here. Maybe it's just me. But that's the situation, is that our wisdom is not adequate to serving on our own resources. If we're going to leave God out of the picture, if we're going to say, I know what needs to be done, I'm going to serve, we're just going to rush into service because service is something that we're geared toward. If we're going to do this on our own power, we're going to find that, number one, our heart is deceitful, number two, we don't have the wisdom. And one of the things that happens is you find yourself, if you do this on your own power, you will end up serving in ways that are counterproductive. There's been all kinds of situations. I used to be much more involved in missions. And when I was on the mission field, there were a number of times when I would talk to missionaries and they would tell me about these great ideas that they had and that completely backfired because they lacked the wisdom and it went completely poorly. And we find that this is the case. How many times have you tried to help someone or a situation and you got it completely wrong? And even though you thought you were doing the right thing, it wasn't the right thing at all. And finally, the problem with our service is that, first of all, we have a heart problem. Second of all, we have a wisdom problem. And finally, we have a righteousness problem. Our righteousness is like filthy rags. We have bad intentions, poor wisdom, and we have a bad sense of morality. We have a bad sense of knowing what needs to be done and the right thing to do in the right moment. What happens is, as the result of Martha just setting out on her course of, I'm going to serve, is she decides that she knows what God needs. The text tells us that she's distracted. She's not listening to what is going on. She's not listening to what Jesus is saying. She's distracted. She's distracted with much service. Now think about this. Think about Jesus goes and shows up to her home, and he's sitting there. He's sitting there speaking. He's saying what things need to be heard, right? He's the one who has the floor. And she's up there deciding, no, this is what needs to be done. And we need to make a chicken salad, right? And we need to make sure that the mayonnaise hasn't turned bad. And we need to make sure that the doilies are out so that so it looks pretty. And we need to, and she's doing all this stuff. She's wanting to make it great. But it's in her mind. She's deciding what should be happening there. And when reality doesn't conform to her, what she says is, she says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. She's saying, look, Jesus, you're talking about things. I'm distracted. I don't know what they are. But here's what you should be saying. So my point here is this, is that all of us fall into this trap. I'm not picking on Martha. Martha's doing something that all of us do on a regular basis. She's telling God what he needs. And think about it this way. You might say, well, they do need to eat. They do need... Jesus can handle it. He goes, and there's a kid. He's got 5,000 people listening to him, and no Martha. What's he going to do? He's going to take a kid's lunch and feed 5,000 people with it, right? He doesn't need her. And this is the thing that's so important for us to understand, is that God's invitation to our service does not come from his need. God's not sitting there going, man, if Steve doesn't come through, I don't know what I'm going to do. He doesn't do that. He's not, God, it's never entered his mind, right? The phrase that's never entered God's mind is, if Steve doesn't come through, I don't know what I'm going to do. But there have been plenty of times when I've thought that that's what God's thinking. Now, I haven't actually come out and said those words to myself, but by my behavior, that's what I've been expressing through what I'm doing is, man, what will God do without me? I think He's going to do just fine. Do you know what God needs? Do you know what God needs? Do you know who should win the election? Do you know who should win the war? Do you know how the economy should go? Do you know what kind of job you should get? Do you know that, here's the thing I'm saying is that the problem that we have is that when we start just heading out to serve and putting service first, and that's what we're talking about. When you put service first, you will start making those decisions for God. And it always ends up in a bad place, and it gets so subtly. We were talking earlier about mega churches that end up, as a scandal series on like Netflix or something, right? It didn't start off that way. But what happened is people put service first. And that's what it ends up. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 21 through 23, it says, "From that time Jesus began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." Jesus is telling His disciples, hey, here's what's going to happen. And it's not good. But it gets worse. In verse 22, it says, "And Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him." Rebuke Jesus. Peter began to rebuke Him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But He turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man." What is He saying is, you don't know the mind of God. So how can you tell me what I need and what I don't need? See, if you put service first, you're going to find yourself in that same position over and over and over again. It doesn't matter if it's talking about your relationship with your spouse. It doesn't matter if you're talking about your relationship with your kids. It doesn't matter if you're talking about serving the church or your job or whatever it is. But if you put service first, you will find yourself in the position of trying to tell God what He needs. And it's not just Martha who's been down that road. It's not just Peter who's been down that road. Most of us have been down that road. So let's learn from them. Saul himself, King Saul, was down that road. Remember when he was supposed to be at war, and the prophet hadn't showed up to give the sacrifice. And so what did he do? Well, I'll do it for him. You see, what we mistake is we mistake the idea of prayer. This is what will happen. If you put service first, your prayers will stop turning into asking and start turning into telling. If you put service first, your prayers will not be prayers. There will be times where you tell God what He needs to do. Because what is a prayer? What does it mean to pray? Have you guys ever heard like the old, you're watching a movie or something that happens in olden times, and they're frilly costumes and stuff. There's no explosions, so I don't usually watch them, but I've seen it on TV regularly. And they say things like, "Go to the town and save the fair princess, I pray thee." Have you guys heard that? I pray thee. You guys heard that term? They're not talking about praying to God. The term pray actually means to beseech. It means to ask. When you're in prayer, there's a reason why the natural position of prayer was to be on your knees. And it's because it's a position of humility. You're recognizing the difference between you and God and the fact that God has everything. And that you're in the position of not being able to give to God. You're in the position of receiving from God. You're in the position to ask from God. What's your life about? Well, why is it that God has you on this earth for however many years He's going to have you here? What's His purpose in having you here? It's so that you can open your eyes and open your ears. So you can see the reality of who He is and see the reality of who you are. And the thing is that you can only really see the reality of who you are when you see the reality of who He is. Because without that, it's just too frightening. Adam and Eve had their eyes open and immediately they wished they were closed. They wanted to cover themselves. They wanted to cover the truth of their inadequacy. And the reason they did that is because they stopped believing in a God who was adequate, a God who loved them and cared about them and had their best interest at heart. You see, the thing is that as you see God, you can see yourself clearly. And when you do that, you recognize that the reality is that God is in the position of giver, and I am in the position of receiver. And if I ever turn that around, and that's what always happens when we put service first, then I am getting everything backwards. See, so many times we think we know what needs to happen, and the reality is that it's only because we see the surface and not what's underneath. See, God knows the hearts of people. And oftentimes He knows that the very thing we ask for, because it's going to make the circumstances okay, are going to turn people's hearts in the wrong direction. And so God will allow pain, and He'll allow suffering, and He'll allow things to go poorly. Why? Because those are the things that often turn our hearts back toward Him. Well, let's talk about vine and branches, because this is really kind of the heart of the issue. In John chapter 15, there's a passage here that really gets to the point of what the problem here was with Martha, with Peter, with us. Jesus here says in verse 1 of chapter 15 of John, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes, that it may be more fruitful. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. What is Jesus saying here? He's saying something in longer form that He's saying here to Martha. He says, you're anxious and you're troubled about many things. You see a whole bunch of things. And He's saying, but one thing is necessary. What is that one thing? Well, one of the ways that theologians look at reality is that there are things that need to unify your life. And so you can kind of think about like a game, like basketball as an example. You know, in basketball, you bounce the ball. That's one of the things you do. You pass the ball. That's another thing. You throw the ball through the hoop. But here's the thing about most games, is that most of the things that you do in the game don't make sense outside of the game, right? I mean, you don't really find people who just sit there and bounce the basketball and you say, oh, you like to play? You're like, no. This is what I like to do. I just bounce this basketball. That's all I do. It's pretty fun. You should check it out. I've been bouncing this basketball for 20 years. You ever played the game? No, never once. Don't need to. Bounce the ball. Right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Or passing. You know, they come to you and go, you should pass with me. Why? We practicing? We play? No. You should just pass. Why? Because, well, what would the purpose be? Just do it. Right? The idea is that in all those things that you have to have the game as the thing that unifies everything else. Right? The higher order things always unify the lower things. And they make sense of them. They put them into perspective. And what Jesus is saying here is something very vital. He's saying that, look, Mary has chosen to sit under my feet to listen to my word. And that is the thing that orders everything else. If you don't do this, then what's going to happen in your life is you're going to have a whole bunch of things in your life. And they're going to cause great stress and anxiety because you haven't listened to me. You haven't put me where I belong. And because you haven't put me where I belong, everything's at odds with each other. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt like your life is out of control and that everything in your life is competing with everything else? There's time for this, there's time for that, there's time for this. This thing, you know, the backyard needs to be mowed, and then the pool needs to be cleaned, and then this has to happen, and my kids need to go there, and this and all of these things are competing. That's because you haven't made the one thing the one thing. That's right. And it will keep being like that. In fact, it'll get worse until you make the one thing the one thing. Right? Until you connect yourself to God, until you sit at Jesus' feet, until you make His relationship with you the thing that orders everything else, until you stop deciding what God needs, until you stop putting service first, because that's what you're doing, right? You're going to serve the backyard, it needs to be mowed. You're going to serve the pool, it needs to be clean. You're going to serve the kid, they need to eat lunch. You're going to serve the other kid, it needs to be to take them to basketball practice. You're serving everything. You're putting service first. And until you put Jesus first, everything's going to be out of order. What's really fascinating here is Jesus makes it very clear that abide in me and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Look, you can live detached. You can exist detached, but you cannot bear fruit detached. You will run around doing all kinds of things, but none of them will be fruitful. None of them will have a lasting impact. None of them will actually put things in the state that they need to be in, and they won't stay in that state. And the more you run around, the more you'll find that this thing didn't stay right, that thing didn't stay right, this thing, now you've got a problem over here. Right? Why? Because you're not making the one thing the one thing. You're not connected. Jesus' word is what creates reality. And so when Mary decides that she's going to listen to the word, she's doing the thing that is going to create the reality of her life in the way that God wants it to be. She's loving Jesus. And that's what needs to come first. Do not put service above love of Christ. Service is second. Service comes out of that love. It does not replace that love. And if it does, you will find your life falling apart. In John chapter 14, verse 21, there's this passage that says, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. And what an amazing thing for Jesus to say. The one who loves me is the one who keeps his commands. Well, here's the thing. It takes love to be motivated to keep Jesus' commands, because the human heart does not necessarily want to do it. The human heart just doesn't want to obey Jesus. The human heart just doesn't want to do that. Unless you truly love him, unless you sit at his feet and see his glory and find joy in him, unless you see the goodness of him, the beauty of him, the grandeur of him, unless you see all those things and you're completely taken up in that and you celebrate him and you can't think of anything better than him, and that then manifests itself in you listening to his word and obeying it, well, then everything changes. But if you don't sit at Jesus' feet and listen to the word and you don't obey the word, how do you expect your life to manifest anything other than chaos? Jesus says we have to remain in him, because the truth is anything not done from love of Christ is slander. Anything not done from the love of Christ is slander. And here's the thing. I know something about this. I know something about this, because there are times, when you're a pastor, there are jobs that you love to do. There are parts of the job. It's like anything else, Yeah, how many of you guys have parts of your job that you love? The job that you do now, parts of it you love, right? How many of you have parts of your job that you don't love? It's the same. But here's what's really easy. It's really easy to be like, when you're doing the part of the job that you don't love, to be like, I don't really like doing this, but here we go. Right? And you start kind of a little grumbling a little bit. And what happens is that becomes a slander to the name of Christ. It becomes a slander to the name of Christ, because the thing is that what you're basically saying is the balance of the scales is in my favor. As if he's asking you to do something that's not for your benefit. As if he's asking you to do something that's not good for you. Would God ever ask you to do something that wasn't ultimately to your good? But you act like you're doing him the favor. It's really interesting that the result of not remaining in him does something to Martha's relationships. Notice in verse 40 it says, she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Notice a couple of things that have happened here. Number one, she's turned into her sister's accuser. She's not helping me, and she should be. She goes to Jesus and accuses her sister of wronging her. And then the second thing that she does is that she then becomes Jesus' accuser. Don't you care? What's the implication there? You don't care. You don't care. You're not seeing this. You're either unaware of what's going on, or you're uncaring that it's going on. And what happens is that when we don't put the love of Christ first, we always will end up being his accuser. And that is death for our relationship to him. And that in turn is death to everything in our life. The third point that we need to understand here that's so important is that we are served by Christ. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And I can't stress how important that is. In John chapter 13, verse 8, it says, Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Another great thing that Peter's doing here. Remember, Jesus was washing all their feet, and Peter said, "You will never wash my feet." And the thing is, Jesus put himself in a very humble position. He's taking on the job of the lowest servant in the house. And Jesus is taking that on. It's a gross job. It's a disgusting job. And so, out of concern, I guess, for Jesus, but again, deciding what Jesus needs in his life, deciding what he's going to do and not do, he says, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Jesus is saying, look, if I'm not washing your feet, then we have no relationship. There's no connection between us if I'm not washing your feet. Why is that? Because that's the nature of the relationship. The nature of the relationship is that God serves us. God provides us with everything. There is nothing that we have that is good that's not from God. There is no task, there is no burden that Jesus has not borne for us. And if you say, well, I'm not going to be in this position where I'm served by you, then you're not going to have a relationship at all with Jesus, because that's the nature of the relationship. Is he is the prince and we are the pauper. He is the king of the giant estates and we are the homeless person, the beggar. The reality is that we have nothing to give Jesus, and he has everything to give us. And so if you won't be served by Christ, you won't have a relationship with him. Amen. The reality is that his service, his invitation to service with us, is his way of blessing us. I was watching a YouTube channel called Vice Grip Garage. This guy goes off and he finds these old cars that aren't running and he fixes them up. He has a little son that's helping him, and he's telling his son, well, why don't you do this, why don't you do that? He says, okay, and he's going and doing it. And he comes back to the camera and he goes, could be that Dad has a couple of other agenda items in having my son help me. He was basically cluing in the camera that it wasn't just about having a task accomplished. That he had things that he was hoping to form in his son. He had gifts that he wanted to give his son that were only available by his son helping him. That is when we serve God. He's serving us. And unless you're connected to God, you put that the other way around.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.